Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. So today I'm delighted to be joined not by one, but by two guests, two great adoptees, two very powerful people within the world of, I guess, what would we call it? Adoptee literature. Alice and Marci run the co-founders of the Adoptee Literacy Fest. Welcome to the show, Marci and Alice.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah. Thank you, Simon.
So we've been chatting, listeners, we've been chatting before the recording started. And Alice was saying that what you were trying to do with the Adoptee Literacy Festival is to change the narrative around adoption. So, and you were looking. You feel that adoption is not portrayed in an authentic way, and there are some inauthentic voices in this space. So, what is it that you're trying to do?
Well, thank you for having us on, Simon. With the Adoptee Literary Festival, we are trying to highlight adoptee voices. We have found that adoption is a very popular subject in mass entertainment, but especially in literature, starting with early, books about orphans that are hundreds of years old that sentimentalize the whole story of the pitiable orphan that gets rescued. And this kind of narrative has persisted to this day, not just in novels, but in movies and TV shows. And so as adoptees, Marci and I were both concerned about this and wanted to tell the public that there is an authentic version of the stories written by adoptees. They're not all the same story. We are not a monolith. We all have different stories, but just to get those stories together and to highlight them and have other adoptees find us, have other non-adoptees find us, have the publishing industry take notice of what we're trying to do, and just get that sort of kernel of an idea out there that people need to change the way that they look at adoption.
Yeah. So I have to go back to apologize because this isn't, did I mention it twice? Did I call it the Literacy Festival? That would be if we're concerned about adoptees' abilities to read and write, that they need a literacy festival. And right now I'm blushing a little bit red on the screen. So apologies. This is the Adoptee Literary Festival. We're not concerned about adoptees' ability to read and write. What we're concerned about is changing this narrative, and I guess putting adoptees at the forefront of that, because it's usually non-adoptees that are talking about this stuff, and perhaps the two myths. The two myths. In my we know about the rainbow and unicorns myth, but in my, this is just my take, right? And I'm interested in what you're thinking about it. My take is we seem to have flipped completely from one monolith of rainbows and unicorns to the other monolith of forever traumatized, and I don't think that narrative is accurate either. But what do you think?
So I'll jump in. I think that part of that is what has come before. So because of the rose-colored lens from which previous adoption narratives have been discussed in history, I think also from from a position of power, some of that is that I wouldn't say not just trauma. I think that there's a lot of rage that is well warranted. And it's a combination of many things. There's a history of family separations from the beginning of time with colonizers and militaristic countries taking children as tribute to keep countries in line. There are the colonizers who took the native children and put them in boarding schools to whitewash them, steal all their language, and their culture, and consider them blank slates. There's also, if you think of the way that families were treated during slavery times, right? Like children were literally bought and sold separate. They were considered commodities. I think there is a certain element of anger that is very important to recognize, that comes in a recognition of that trauma, which is also a recognition that that's a story of rainbows and unicorns is not actually accurate. And it is intended to sanitize a story that is actually truly horrific. And I think that when we think of that perspective, that it's a much larger conversation than trauma itself. It is that moment of recognition. It's an understanding of what has been lost before you even were able to have language. It's an understanding that there are certain things that can never be gotten back, and that everyone around you might be saying your pain is not valid. You should be a certain way. We do not recognize that you might have a different experience from what we want you to have. And I think that's very similar to many marginalized groups and communities. I think that isn't by any stretch unique to the adoptee perspective. But I do think that it is something that is often overwritten, because we think of children as blank slates, and we think of children as something that we have some sort of right to, or even in terms of what we tell ourselves, like we are protecting children. There are, of course, going to be really horrific stories, but there are going to be really beautiful stories. And that's also one of the reasons why we opened up the Adoptee Literary Festival to incorporate as many different voices and as many different demographics and ages and genres as possible, because we didn't want to just sit with one type of narrative. We didn't want to just say we're all angry, because not every adoptee is angry. We didn't want to say that every adoptee has a happy ending, because that's also not true. We wanted to acknowledge that everyone has a very unique experience, and that there are similarities that can connect us, which storytelling does, right? But we also wanted to just be able to say, you are not alone. We are out here. And we also have been told the same things about what our narrative should be. We also are trying to take back our own stories. We also are trying to say, I exist, my pain is valid, my joy is valid, and share that with each other, and empower each other just as much as we are trying to say, this is an important educational opportunity for adoptees, non-adoptees, organizations, publishers, and the general public. So there's many different things to consider when we are trying to distill down to, this is one way or this is another way.
Yeah, fascinating.
I also think that there is trauma in the rainbows and unicorn story. That gives us trauma, and it is only recently that adoptees have been able to voice their trauma. We've been told to be grateful and silent for so long, and it's only maybe it's because I'm kind of late to the scene, but it seems to me that it's just in the last decade that adoptees have grown more confident of their voices, more feeling like they have that right to tell people what it actually feels like to be adopted, to push back against, the rainbows and unicorn narrative. So it was, I'm sorry, somebody's at my door, and I have to answer that. I'm really sorry.
That's okay, Alice. Listeners, we had this happen to me 25 minutes ago. So my wife was on the phone saying, the delivery man's coming up the drive, you better go out and answer the door. This is real life. So yeah, and it's one of those that it's Murphy's law, is it? It's the way that it's the thing about the piece of toast with marmalade on it always lands side, with the marmalade side down, or goes over the floor. And in the same way, the couriers always turn up knock on our door when we're doing a podcast. So Marci, if I can pick up on that, following this, you use the word empowerment, which is a big one for me. Empowerment and inspiration. That's what we're trying to do, listeners. We're trying to share the guests' learnings, so to empower and inspire you. How does writing one's story, how does that help adoptees thrive? How does it help empower them? How does it help them come to terms with stuff? What effects have you seen and heard about from the writers within the festival?
Yeah, so Alice is an active teacher of adoptee writers, and I would love to hear what she has to say. What I can say is that both Alice and I are ourselves writers. She's a prose writer and a secret poet, and I am a poet. And I think that for us, and by extension, the authors who were represented at our inaugural Adoptee Literary Festival, in many ways, it is a way to make sense of the world and the stories that we were told, and to undo the stories we were told when we knew in our bodies that it was not true. So that rainbow narrative of, be grateful, what a life you could have had, what a horrible life you could have had if you had not been adopted, that sort of thing. Obviously you are loved, all that stuff is not always true. In my case, it was not true. And so writing was a way to unlearn a narrative that was repeated to us by people who didn't understand what they were talking about. And also for me, a way to replace that narrative with one that made sense to me. And Alice and I have often talked about adoptees having to create our own mythologies. What are our origins? What are our powers and weaknesses? What is our future that we're building for ourselves? And when we spoke to many of the adoptee writers, it was very similar in the presentations. If you look at the archive, many of them were like, I thought I was the only one who felt this. I thought I was alone. I didn't know there were others like me. And so part of what a story does is it works on you internally as the author, but it also is meant to be shared. And whether or not that person is also like you, if they are not like you, they are learning to appreciate another human being. If they are like you, they might recognize something in themselves and in you that is healing for them as well. And I think that way you are reclaiming your own power over your own storytelling of your life and the things that you tell yourself you are or aren't or can do or can't do, and learn to love yourself a certain way. And in that's very healing. And in sharing it, there's an idea in psychology that your joy is only complete when you share it with someone else, which is why you want to tell great news to people. It's why you don't want to hold in all that. That's why we have parties, right? And so telling your story is a way to say, I am alive, I have lived, I exist in this way. This is my story, and it deserves to be told to someone else. And that is what all the adoptee authors at the festival did, is they shared their stories. They shared, even in fiction, right? It's not just memoir, it's every part of you comes through in whatever you're writing. And so that that is a way to empower yourself and the audience listening. And there were many readers and non-writers in the audience who suddenly found the power of storytelling palpably powerful in a way they hadn't before. And that was a lot of the feedback that we received. And Alice, I would love to hear what you have to say, because you are an active teacher and you have seen many cohorts and writers and non-writers actively trying to tell their own stories.
Well, as always, Marci, you've articulated it very beautifully. I think one thing that I've really learned from teaching these writing or facilitating these writing groups is that a lot of the adoptees don't feel like they have the right to tell their story. They feel like they have to hide it. They can't share it. So a lot of it is just telling the adoptees that, yes, you have that right. This is your story. Nobody else owns your story. Don't let somebody else tell your story, and don't let somebody else shut up your story. But unfortunately, you know, we have so many obligations to other people, so many things that stand in our way. Oh, but you know, these people rescued me, and how can I then tell the truth about what my actual experience was? So I feel like there's just a lot of power in numbers for people, especially for adoptees who they might be isolated, they might not know a lot of other adoptees, they might not be very connected with the community, and just to see that there are these people who've come before you, who've done it, who've survived, who've found a community, who've grown through it. I think that's really empowering, and we heard from a lot of adoptees that they were inspired to pick up their pen after the literary festival, which is exactly what we wanted to happen, and that they were joining writing groups and that sort of thing. So it's, you know, I think that we really gave people permission to tell their own story, to speak up. Which is great. And the other great thing I think about being an adoptee writer is, and the reason why we're so, you know, good at it, or why our stories should be read, is that we interrogate our world in a way that most people who, you know, belong just don't even think about it. But as adults, you know, we generally we don't come into our adoptee selves until we are full-grown adults. And so just to, you know, that permission, or that interrogation of the world around you keeps you much more, you know, intellectually alive, much more agile of mind, and able to see the world more clearly. You're not stuck in, you know, I know so many people who are stuck in their high school minds, and they're full-grown adults, and they just can't, you know, their favorite book is what they read in high school, and they still have those opinions, and they don't think about why they have those opinions. Whereas adoptees, we have to think about it, and we have to say, you know, we have to question everything that we see in the world.
Yeah. So before we started recording, I was sharing some wisdom from Emma Stevens, who was on the podcast a few episodes ago, and something that I read in her memoir, which was actually far more about what she'd learned than I thought it was going to be. It wasn't a history of her life; it was a history of what she's learned through her life, and she used this term when she talked about her addiction with alcohol, but she also talked about the fact that we are addicted to our thoughts, and I thought that's so true. We are addicted to our thoughts, and we're addicted to the thoughts often around adoption. So one, you know, why me? Why did it happen? What's not, you know, what or the it shouldn't have happened. And then, you know, the take that you were talking about earlier on in terms of the injustice, the clear injustice of this stuff, and the colonization, those sorts of things. So we're stuck in those kind of thoughts. And when you said to when you said Alice, about stuck in our high school mindset, the first thought that actually came to my mind is that I'm stuck with my my musical interests from those years, right? I'm stuck in the 80s. I'm still listening to the bands that I listened to as a teenager. I just dropped that into perhaps lighten the mood a bit, you know. But I thought, yeah, are we addicted? Are we addicted to the thoughts that we had as teenagers? When oftentimes, you know, people talk that as, you know, puberty being tough for everybody. Not just adoptees, like for the human race, and you know, coming to terms with who I am. I'm just dropping that in there. What do you see around what frees us from that addiction to thought? What unsticks our mindset? And I'm thinking of the one that comes to my mind is that Carol Dweck book, Growth Mindset, which it's got nothing to do with adoption. It's about it's moving from I can't do this to I can't do it yet. The big word is yet, and she spends a lot of words and a lot of time explaining that. So what is it that you've seen that helps writers, adoptees free themselves from that high school or historic mindset?
I think that's different for every person. And I think it depends on what they're working against in their own histories. And you know, that growth mindset, which requires a recognition of what you can and can't do, right? And where you want to be versus where you are, and the way that you deal with failure, whether you believe failure is a beginning or an ending point. And so you probably have heard this many times, that statistically adoptees are 4 times more likely to attempt or succeed in committing suicide. That isn't just them. That is also, there's a lot of external factors to consider. So when we think about that question, you have to think about, you know, there are people who are going to be starting in a range of starting points, right? Of how much good or bad things have happened to them in their lifetime to work through, and what resources they have now to be able to even begin to think about it. Are they still in survival mode? I think I can speak for myself that I think reading was the one thing I could do safely in my house. And reading, there's a famous James Baldwin quote that's, you think your pain and heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. And it showed me that I was not alone, despite being isolated in a really rural place with no other children. And that there was a possibility of a way out. I think that's one of the reasons I became a writer. I think the very tiny library in my town saved my life because of the stories that were contained in it. And I was really fortunate to have incredible mentors along the way who encouraged me, as opposed to discouraging me, to tell my story in a certain way, the way that I wanted to tell it. I think that I don't know where my own survival instincts come from. I know that it's not in everyone, right? I think I'm always thinking about the facts, like emotions are information. I'm really logic driven because emotions will fail me. So when I think about stories, I am always thinking about what are the facts. When I was starting to think about adoptee communities, I was thinking about statistics, which is weird because I don't love statistics and I'm terrible at math, but those helped ground me and say, okay, this is bigger than me. I don't need to be overwhelmed because other people have survived far worse, and I can survive this too. I just need information to prepare myself. And so I think in some ways for me that is a way that writing synthesizes all of the data in my head to be able to then say, I'm going to write, and I'm going to write a story or a poem, or I'm going to write an essay, right? I'm going to write copy for a website, whatever it might be that might get more information. So often when I'm on adoptee centric panels, I will talk about the statistics of, historical data and things like that, because that's something that not a lot of, like a lot of other adoptees are, as we have spoken about earlier, very story centric. But there are a lot of people who are going to respond better to facts. They're going to respond better to data. They're going to, so thinking about all the different people that might need to think differently, my job is to provide information and then let people do with it what they want. But I think, we do have to consider starting points and resources and equity. And I think that's one of the reasons that we wanted to keep the festival free, was because we didn't want even the smallest things to be a barrier. We didn't want an internet connection to be a problem for people to be able to tune in live, which is why we have the entire archive up on YouTube. So it's there, like we wanted to think about ways to think about accessibility that long-term might help people in ways we will never see and never know. And we are always tinkering with how to improve. I think because we know that we are part of this community, and every little bit is maybe one half step for someone, and it might save a life and it might empower someone. And that's worth it. That's worth everything that we're doing.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. This is so powerful and so nuanced. The way you put it, it's beautiful. And normally I'm right with the guest, right? I'm really tuned in. But what you said about a drive to survive at the start of that answer was kind of nagging me whilst you were talking the rest, and I was kind of lost. I was kind of lost in that, or the importance of that. And we're talking about hope, we're talking about escape, we're talking about empowerment, and yet that life force. You said that. I think you said that some of us don't have it, and I thought, we all have it, and yet it's shrouded. It's like a stream that's frozen over. And hopefully what we're trying to do, or hopefully what we're doing here with this episode, is we are putting some cracks in the ice so that people can see the life force as the stream underneath them flowing past. And I'm thinking, you were saying that you weren't great at maths. It's straight. I'm the other way around, right? I was great. I was great at maths pretty much all the way through school. I did have one blip, but my English was poor at 8. The school said your English is poor. So my parents, Simon needs to read more books, right? So I'm quite pleased that I remembered somebody else's metaphor of the ice and the frozen thing, and made it kind of my own for the adoption space. So yeah, that life force, that life force, it's who we are, and it's often shrouded. And for me, the life force that I am, it is shrouded by this, the we talk about the story, but the story in my head, right? There's a story, the internal narrator. So yeah, I'm going on a bit here. But I want to drop in one last thing about addiction, because I know this is an issue for a lot of adoptees. I read a book about addiction, and it was the opposite of what we're trying to do here. It was 99.9% story. And buried in, I listened to it, I think it was about 6 hours, this audiobook. And buried in there was one sentence that turned this guy's life around from being an addict to not being an addict. And it was one sentence. And I was going, yes, this is it. But he explained it, right? He set out this sentence, and then he went back to the story. And I was like, talk about what it's and what he learned, right, was, what he realized in a epiphany moment, an insight moment, a huge aha, a massive shift in his consciousness, was that the life force that he truly is bigger than the addiction. So life force is bigger than addiction. He saw his own power. He wasn't looking at a mirror saying, empower me to stop this thing. He saw his own power. He felt his own life force. And I had tingling hairs on the back of my neck in like, but he then went straight back to the story and didn't kind of draw attention, explore what that life force is. He just went back to his story. So whilst I was listening to you, you said, did you do that well? And I was thinking, I wish I'd known, because all I wanted to talk about was this idea that we are bigger than our addictions. We are bigger than the voice in our head that says that we can't get through stuff. And now I'm in danger of overshadowing your stuff, because the idea of the Thriving Adoptees podcast is that the guests share their wisdom. It's not the Simon Ben's wisdom show. So I apologize, but I just I had to let that go.
I love that you remembered that sentence, that there is a whole book built around a sentence that struck you. And I think that the cracks in the ice are very similar to what Alice was mentioning earlier, where her job as the instructor of writing is to give permission. That is a person that's sitting there with the chisel saying, here's a crack. Let's open the crack, right? Like, Alice, do you want to say more about or respond to?
Yeah, no, I think that it is really, for me, the greatest thing, the greatest gift or whatever I can give to the people who come to the Adoptee Voices writing group is confidence. That confidence that, yes, you can tell that story, you have the right to tell that story, and you are a writer. All you have to do is write it down. So I think a lot of adoptees just don't feel that confidence that they can tell their stories. And in showing them the whole community, that there is a whole community out there with the literary festival, that people are doing this, that they're surviving, that they're thriving. Just to empower them to get that, to just start on that journey. And you don't have to be concerned about publishing either. Writing is a very freeing thing. It's very healing. That there's a reason why so many people keep journals. It's because to manifest your innermost emotions into an organized, coherent thought helps you psychologically, helps you communicate to other people better. So I think that writing is a very important tool for just being healing, or discovering yourself, discovering your identity. And so that's one of my main motivations is, yes, I do want people to have the confidence to try and get published. But first, I want them to, just understand that it's okay that you have a friend in yourself, and all you have to do is, get into a dialogue with yourself on the page.
Yeah. Yeah. What gets in the way of that permission? Because you're doing this great work, you're sharing, you're modeling what the change that you want to see in the world. So you're being the change that you want to see in the world, as Gandhi would say. You're setting it all out, you're providing the forum. What gets in the way of adoptees giving themselves permission to start? Darkening the page, is that what they call it? Darkening the page, putting some ink on paper.
I've never heard of it referred to that way, but okay. You've coined a new phrase, Simon. I think it is that reluctance to actually give voice to a lot of these feelings that they've been told that are not valid. Also, fear of their own selves, their own feelings, and what they could maybe unleash. So another great thing about the Adoptee Voices Writer Group is that we then share with each other. And in sharing, you are then, communicating your innermost thoughts to other people, and that getting that reaction that your writing is good, your feelings are valid, these people understand what you're saying, you have made a difference to them. In that protected adoptee space is just it's like a giant first step.
Yeah.
And maybe they don't want to become, a novelist or whatever, but we have people who come back session after session because of the community, that community of like-minded adoptees who are interested in the same thing, which is exploring the effect of adoption through writing.
Yeah.
And I think like this community for me is really one of, I did not discover the adoptee community until recently, and it has been just so wonderful for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you heard of an adoptee writer? He's no longer with us, and he wrote nothing about adoption at all, actually. But a gifted guy. There's a guy called Sydney Banks. Heard of him? Sid Banks?
Mm-mm.
So he was a Scottish welder. I think if he was still alive, he'd be probably in his 90s or even over 100 now. It's a Scottish welder who moved to near Vancouver, I think it was, Salt Spring Island, and he had an enlightenment experience. He never talks about being adopted in his stuff, in his book, but it's somewhere within his bio somewhere. And he said a phrase: if you talked about being fear of our own feelings. Mm. Fear of our own feelings, and it's something like, yeah, who isn't afraid of their own feeling? So I've done quite a good. Well, I could be Olympic gold medalist at worrying, and then worrying about worrying, and then worrying about worrying about worrying. And Sid Banks said something like, if only we could stop being afraid of our own experience, that would change the world.
Mm. Yeah.
Our feelings, we can kind of, yeah. What I came up with a metaphor for this for myself about, I don't know, 12 years ago, and it was about, and I'm not saying that I do it most of the time or even some of the time, right? It was kind of like snuggling up to our fear, snuggling up to my fear. Yeah, not being afraid of being afraid. What do you see, or what sorts of things do you see, given that adoptees are not monoliths? What sorts of things do you see within writers in terms of them snuggling up to their fear and their trauma as they write their books?
Well, I think poets actually do a really good job of really synthesizing the adoptee experience in a way that captures sort of the nebulousness of the whole thing, because poets have such a freedom, and they don't have to make sense. Like Carrie, they can make leaps and bounds that are not so available to prose writers. So I love reading adoptee poets. I love and Marci does this so well, just the whole origin story she creates for herself, and it's so rich, and it's so like mythic, and yet on a granular level, and it's not just like, I don't think that it's only for adoptees. I think it's such a universal story. So in my opinion, it's really the poets who capture the adoptee experience the best. Do you agree, Marci?
I'm blushing over here. I think it's, I don't know, I feel like adoptees don't give themselves enough credit for the many small ways that they snuggle up to their fears in everyday experiences. And that can be something as straightforward as filling out a basic medical checkup form where they're asking what's your family history and you don't have any, and you sit there and you hold your crap together in that moment. It can be something as simple as watching a movie that with a very tender parent-child relationship and realizing that you don't have anyone in your life who looks like you or who will genetically look anything like you or be blood related. It's the small moments that we don't give ourselves credit for, where we are facing our fears and not even realizing it, I think. And the writers who are tapping into those moments in any genre or in any form, or artists of any kind, are I think the ones who are being brave. I think Alice and I talk a little bit about brave spaces as creating space for people to take risks, for people to tell stories that they wouldn't share elsewhere. And I think that next to fear is shame. There is a lot of shame to be undone for adoptees about their own life, as if they could control their history, right, of how they've gotten to the families they've gotten. And I think too that one of the reasons that I keep coming back to emotion is information is because otherwise it will scare me too much, right? But emotion as information is a safe, objective thing for my brain to cover. And I think also that in some ways, because adoptees are often having to parent themselves, self-soothe. And I think that's also, we've talked about addiction. I think that's where addiction tendencies come in, is that self-soothing technique. I mean, mine was video games for years. But I think that a lot of that work is often done for the first time on the page in private. And so Alice's really powerful moments of being like, I'm just a guide helping these people, you know, ask questions of themselves and giving them prompts that really help them to release some of that fear, release some of that shame, and come to themselves honestly. That's a gift. But that's also perhaps an issue of accessibility or awareness, that people don't know that that's something that's out there, or is it affordable for them, or you know, am I the only one doing this? Like, am I doing this right because I have to be perfect because that was the role that I played in my family, right? There's a lot of fear that we live with every day that just sort of sits on our shoulders, that we don't give ourselves credit for surviving every day. Yeah. You know, and being stronger than we think we are, because we've worked that muscle of survival a lot, which comes back to your question of life force, right? It's like, you are bigger than the addiction, you are bigger than your fear, you're bigger than your shame. And every adoptee I've ever met is bigger than their adoptee identity. And it's hard to remember that when the world is telling you that's all that you are, that's why you exist, that's why you are here in this point in time. And I think that when you see the light bulb go off for someone, because I remember it very well for myself, is that is when an adoptee chooses to start thriving, is when they realize that they are greater than one aspect of their identity. I have a really wonderful friend, a writer, EJ Ko, who said to me, we write letters, and at one point I asked her, do I have permission? I don't know if I have permission to write about this. Am I Korean enough? Because I don't feel Korean enough as an adoptee. And she said, you are 100% Korean and 100% American. And it is a flaw in logic to assume you are only 100% of anything. And I was like, oh, like that was my permission moment, right? To be like, we don't have to be a tidy sum of anything. We are messy humans. And this goes for not just adoptees, but it also goes for like adoptive families, right? There's a reason that you are adopted into a family, right? There are decisions made, and a reason that you are not with your first family, your birth family, right? There are decisions made externally, internally around you, right? Like no one is whole. And so those decisions that are made around you and for you go for every human, not just adoptees. I think it's perhaps just more prevalent for adoptees. And so there's that adage, like, do something that scares you every day, right? But I do think that there is merit to understanding that emotions they're not going to be comfortable, but what is on the other side of that discomfort? And you will not change, you will not begin to thrive until the discomfort of being where you are is greater than the discomfort that it will take to get you through the gauntlet to the other side. And I think a lot of people are afraid to let go of the discomfort that they know, because the discomfort they don't know is much more terrifying. And so I feel like our job as organizers, as writers, as adoptees, as women of color, for Alice, there is a way to sort of be a lighthouse for people, that shepherd them across the gauntlet and say that discomfort is not going to last, right? That fear that you have is not going to last forever, but it will be worse if you stay here and you just keep walking, right? Just keep taking that next step, write that next word, that next sentence. And that's part of what we are trying to do with empowering people and giving them space that they've never had before, and telling the publishers, hey, there's not just room for one in your catalog for adoptee stories, right? There is room and interest for every kind of story. Give us a shot. And then when you get in the door, you hold it open for the next person, and hope that that's something that we're also imparting to other adoptees to create their own spaces. We don't want to be an end all be all. We want to be the beginning that inspires other adoptees and other non-adoptees, other people, to make space for more people. And I think that kind of generosity and openness is something that we really live by in our writing and live by in our organizing skills. And I think that's why we get along so well, because it's just kind of there. It's like we don't have to talk about it, or we just believe it, you know.
Yeah, you perfect. What you said, Marci, is perfect. I think the only thing I would add is the vulnerability aspect is that we are taught, or we teach ourselves not to be vulnerable. We teach ourselves to be, you know, strong and not to show any emotion when we feel badly, or, you know, when people make their microaggressions to us, or, you know, when we're told that we're not really a part of the family, and, you know, we just suck it up and we carry on. And so in some ways, becoming a part of the adoptee community and becoming a writer who explores your adoption, you have to be vulnerable. You have to open yourself up. You have to crack open that tight, you know, protective shell that you lacquered yourself with over the years, and trust in that community. And you know, hopefully the community will repay your trust. And that's what Marci and I are trying to do, is make a community that will make people feel safe, but not just safe to stay there, safe enough to go out into the world with what they have to say.
So Marci used the word next steps. I would urge you listeners, the next steps is to look down in the show notes on this podcast where you see the link to the festival and check it out. But before I bring this in, what's the question that I've not asked that you'd like to answer? Or what is it that I've not asked you about? Is there anything? No.
I think you've asked some really great questions. It's a great opportunity for us to have been able to revisit some of our thinking too, and as reinvigorate us as we plan for the next festival.
Yeah. So check out the festival, listeners, and I'm making a concerted effort to have more adoptees on the shows. I've had too many. The balance, I've not achieved the balance that I was. I was trying to set out with balance, but I've been, you know, there's a lot of adoption professionals, there's a lot of adopted parents, and I want to have more adoptees on the show. So if you're listening, listener, and you want to be on the show, if you're an adoptee, then get in touch. Right, Simon at thrivingadoptees.com. Thank you very much, Marci and Alice, and I'd also ask you, you know, put the feelers out. Ask the writers that have taken part in the festival if they want to come on and talk about their story and what they've learned writing their story, publishing their story, or just writing it. Right, as you say, it's not about publishing. We're doing this for ourselves as much as the world. That would be great to have them on. Thank you very much, listeners, for listening, and we will speak to you very soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.